Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. As promised, I'm here in my parents' garden. Welcome back here again. I'm here for my end of year Q&A, first Q&A video on this channel on Newcastle United. What's going on with the club at the moment with their poor form, what could happen in January, Eddie Howe's future, Dan Ashworth's future, general questions. I've had quite a few. Thank you to Sean, to Nick, to Johnny and to Paul for all your questions. So I'll just get straight into it. How much money is there to spend in January? Well, to answer this question, it's very difficult to call an exact number, but the thing to remember with Newcastle in January is that they are still undertaken by FFP rules. They still have to obey those things. Obviously that was in play at the end with Lewis Hall's deal and how they had to get creative around that. Dan Ashworth is on record saying they have to be creative again. So that's to take into account what they can do in January. There isn't a huge amount of money to be splashed around, and I can't imagine that they're going to be spending 40 or 50 million and buying a player that's going to come in and transform the team in the way that, you know, Sven Botman has, or Bruno Guimaraes has, or Alexander Isak has. I don't think that's going to happen, but it definitely doesn't mean nothing can happen. And I think, as I say, Dan Ashworth is on record saying they have to get creative. FFP is still a factor. It doesn't mean that nothing will happen. It just means you're looking at the early point of the window at least. Certainly loan deals, and I'll get into who. That's a different question, but yeah, certainly at the moment it doesn't feel like there's going to be a huge amount of money spent, but there is scope to do something. I think we can take from that it's going to take a while, and Eddie Howe sort of alluded to in his pre-Nottingham Forest presser that Newcastle will go late in this window, and that tends to be what they do in these windows. They you know, Bruno came in late, Gordon came in late last January, Isak in the summer of 2022 as well. It's a theme that Newcastle do. They wait, and then obviously with Lewis Hall as well, they act later on what they can do at the very last second. So I think Newcastle will go the distance in this window. I don't think there's going to be a huge amount spent, but that certainly doesn't mean that they'll be dormant. Obviously, I think things like their current form will impact how much they choose to do. Second question is, as I mentioned, who are the names that Newcastle have been linked with and what positions? And I think the obvious one to start with here is Calvin Phillips. The Manchester City midfielder is linked heavily with the loan move. Newcastle inquired about him last summer. They were very interested when they were looking for a number 6. They opted to go for Sandro Tonali instead and sort of choose a different route into in terms of what they do with their midfield, try and not change the system so much and to unlock Bruno, but to use Tonali as a make way when he's not around to hopefully improve their form, and obviously or to dovetail with him in midfield. Obviously, the situation of which everyone's aware of with Tonali has completely changed what they've had to do. They've had to act on their feet, and I think the game against Forest, as I mentioned in the review of that, showed that a number 6 is absolutely imperative. So they have, at least in an inquiry sense, returned to their plan with Calvin Phillips. It'll be a loan deal, I think, because they still see Tonali when he comes back as an asset. So I'm not sure that this is a long-term thing, and certainly not that they can't afford to do a permanent deal at the moment. So a loan deal's been mooted. It's just whether they can strike a deal with Man City to pay a certain amount of his wages and a hefty loan fee. I think around £7 million has been mooted from what I've heard. So it's just, that's why it's not going to be ready for Monday when the window opens. And I know that's frustrating to some people, but these things do take time and do take negotiation, especially when you're towing the line that Newcastle are with their FFP situation. But I think Phillips is a player that they've been interested in. Phillips is a player that is genuine, and this is a pursuit that they will undertake, that they'll try their best to do, and it'll be one to watch. There's also interest in strikers. Newcastle want another forward who can play across the front, who's young, energetic, somebody who can dovetail with Isak and Wilson if possible, but also fill in for them when both of them, obviously they've both had injury problems, so they're aware of that. Again, this is a difficult one to come up with names. I think it's a profile thing. I think it's very interesting that they went for João Pedro. As I record this, he's just scored a couple of goals for Brighton against Tottenham last night. It's very interesting that they originally went for him and couldn't got a deal over the line for him in the summer of 2022. Instead went for Isak, which I think everybody would not trade in if you asked anybody. But I think that sort of style of striker who can play across the front, who's prolific and young and can be moulded, is something that will be looked at. I'm not convinced that that'll happen in January. I think that is for the summer, just because of options and availability of players and availability of funds. That sort of major surgery will likely happen in the summer. As for January, it's difficult to know, but he's certainly a position that Newcastle are looking to improve on. They were looking to improve on the right wing at the start of last summer. Their opportunity took them elsewhere, but they, as I say, they are going to look at that position again. If an opportunity arises this month, then perhaps, but more likely for the summer. And finally, goalkeeper, I think, is another one more pressing than I think it's been pressing for a while generally. With Nick Pope's ability to kick has meant that his time in the first team is probably going to, long term is in doubt. Has that need for a goalkeeper become more pertinent because Nick Pope is obviously injured for 5 months after doing his shoulder against Manchester United earlier this month? Yes, to answer that point, I think Newcastle are interested actively in looking for a goalkeeper this month. David De Gea is somebody that they are aware of. I can't possibly say whether they're going to get him because the wages that he'll look for, and whether he's a long-term solution to the goalkeeping issue is a doubt. I think Aaron Ramsdale is somebody, again, longer term, who makes more sense because he is a player who is, you could argue, an upgrade on Pope as a quality of goalkeeper. Certainly with his feet, which is where Newcastle want to go with their goalkeeper, is more likely. But again, that's difficult to do in January. So maybe they go for De Gea till the end of the season. There's definitely talks amongst themselves whether that's a possibility. But what will De Gea be interested in terms of wages, in terms of length of contract, in terms of compatibility, in terms of what sort of role he brings, in terms of how good he is to come in and immediately fit into Newcastle. They're all doubtful. I think Martin Dubravka's performances have shown recently that there are doubts as to whether he can carry on, and obviously Loris Karius hasn't come in yet, but there's been a couple of goals against Forest, that goal for Richarlison against Tottenham that come to mind, a couple of goals against Everton he could have done better with as well. Eddie Howe has said that he trusts Martin Dubravka. How long that carries on for, I'm not convinced. So I think a goalkeeper, unlike a striker, is possible, more possible this month. It just depends on whether the right opportunity arises and whether they can do a deal. I'm not sure personally whether David De Gea is the right answer, but we'll see. There is a obvious situation that Nick Pope isn't going to be back till probably the end of the season, if not the start of next. So that's something that they're going to have to consider. Hope that answers the question. On to another question about Dan Ashworth. This is a question that I sort of pinned this whole video on. I think it's a very interesting situation. Obviously, he's been linked with Manchester United. He's been linked with a move to the new Ineos era at Old Trafford. So Dave Brailsford is absolutely interested in bringing Ashworth to Old Trafford. And the truth is that hasn't been shut down from inside the club. The speculation is growing, which is not a good thing. Doesn't mean that Ashworth will go. Doesn't mean that Newcastle are not going to take it lying down. I believe he does have a 12-month clause in his contract, which is a good thing for Newcastle in terms of progression. If he does end up leaving, it'll be a year until he does. And there is a sense with Ashworth that he doesn't want to be known as the person who jumps from job to job, which kind of, certainly from my take, would be that he would look like that if he did go to Manchester United only 18 months after leaving Brighton for Newcastle and having to go through the gardening leave. But my worry, and this is my opinion on it, my take on it, is that that speculation could easily be shut down, and it hasn't been. Now those reports are growing. Would Dan Ashworth, would it be a forward step in his career to go and fix Manchester United or oversee this project at Newcastle? Only he can know. But the question to ask us was about his notice period, and I do believe he does have a 12-month notice period in his contract. So Newcastle are well protected there. But long term, I'm not convinced that he is going to end up staying at Newcastle, because I think if he's not interested, this sort of speculation is easy to kill, and it hasn't been. So but again, I must stress that is just my take on that situation. I don't actually know 100% whether he's interested in Manchester United. That lack of noise is really quite troubling from my perspective. Next, we have a question on Kieran Trippier. What's the reason for his drop in form? Obviously, there's a lot of speculation going around. He came home from England duty early on, and he's since struggled for Newcastle with a few poor performances, a few mistakes that have led to goals. Everyone now thinks about that Chelsea game where he gave the ball to Mudryk and then missed his penalty. Mentally, he's clearly struggling. He's very tired, I think, physically as well. I've made the case on these videos that he should be rested for quite a while. He has obviously felt quite a lot of responsibility, come out quite strongly and said how poorly he thinks he's played. But for me, he's a player that deserves a lot more respect from some fans. There's been a lot of talk about, if he can recover from this, and the vast majority of fans have come out in support of him, but there has been a bit of a murmuring, and for me, he's got incredible amounts of credit in the bank because of how much of an impact he's had on this team. This team is where it is in large part because of how well Trippier adapted when he signed, how much trust he had in this process. All I can say is that Kieran Trippier is a fantastic player, fantastic man. Spoken to him a few times in the mix zone and at different events and stuff, and he really cares about this club. He really cares about standards, which he's admitted have dropped in recent weeks, and I trust him to get back to his best. I just think that Tino Livramento was brought in the summer specifically to ease the load on Trippier, and Trippier's played a lot of games and has been allowed to get to this point where he's now tired and now struggling. So he needs that faith, he needs that backing, but he also, I still believe, needs time out of the team to rest himself and get back to his best. Having said that, it's been 10 games in 30 days between November and December. There's only 3 games in the next 30 days, so there's an opportunity for Trippier and Newcastle generally to get back to their best. The final question I have is on Eddie Howe's future. In my opinion, there's absolutely no reason to sack Eddie Howe at this stage. It's the first difficult run that he's really had since since everything kick-started for him after obviously a difficult start where he was adapting to the situation. Obviously the team was not fit enough to play his style. There was a transitional period between the end of Steve Bruce and the sort of kick-starting of his era. This is the first difficult point. It feels like a quite a seminal moment, a crossroads in Newcastle's future. Do they drop Eddie Howe at this venture and move on to somebody else, or do they allow him the opportunity to fix what's quite a poor run of form? Now, for me, you've got to allow him the ability to get the players back and give him the opportunity to fix that issue, because fatigue and the number of injuries that he's still missing, the likes of Harvey Barnes aren't back, the likes of obviously Nick Pope in goal, as I mentioned earlier on, Jamal Lascelles is now out, obviously missing Sandro Tonali. So many key players have been missing that if you get them all back and get everybody back to full fitness as well, because the other thing is that even the players who have not been missing for injury haven't been fit and at their firing best because they've probably played too many games. So when those mitigating circumstances fully disperse, I think Eddie Howe deserves the opportunity to fix those issues. But the one thing I will say is that Amanda Staveley and Mida Gadusi and Jamie Rubin, I think they will fully support him, but they're not the people who make these decisions. There is a sort of sense that Newcastle can get out of this with players coming back and with the fixtures easing and that sort of thing. I think that can all help Newcastle going forward and Eddie Howe going forward. And I think the other thing is to say is who would come in. There's been talk of Jose Mourinho, but that makes no sense to me anymore. I think stylistically Newcastle are a progressive team. They play high energy football, and if anyone is to come in to replace Eddie Howe, they have to have that same philosophy for it to work, for it to progress. I think if Newcastle get a different kind of manager in who is less likely to adhere to those principles, then you run the risk of going off the rails even further, and Manchester United fans and Tottenham fans will know what going off the rails under Jose Mourinho means. So for me, Eddie Howe is not under pressure at the moment. It looks like it could get worse before it gets better. And whether at the end of January, if Newcastle are in the bottom half, how much goodwill is there going to be towards Eddie Howe? He deserves the end of this season, at least the start of next season. I think that is the understanding within the club as well. So I don't imagine there'll be a change. I think everyone is staying calm. I think Newcastle will be fine. I think they'll get better in the second half of the season when players come back. Joe Willock is an absolutely huge miss. Elliot Anderson, it's about squad depth, it's about quality on the pitch. Both have been decimated, and then fitness levels as well. All three of those things have been decimated. When you look in isolation, it can be difficult to mention those things, but I think overall it's impossible to ignore. I think Eddie Howe will be in place at the end of the season. I think almost no matter what happens, I think he's got so much credit in the bank with everybody, but the unknown of what happens with PIF could have an impact going forward if things really don't improve. I think they won't be happy if they don't get European football at the end of the season. There is a possibility if they don't get European football or even Champions League football that there could be a big sale to help FFP going forward. But I think Newcastle are at the moment staying calm, and I think everybody else should as well. Thank you very much for getting involved in my first Q&A video. I really enjoyed doing it, and I'll see you next time. Please continue to like, share and subscribe. Cheers.